Welcome. We are ready to start tonight's class, and we are in a very, very, should I use the word intense parsha, a parsha which contains many commandments. Matter of fact, there is over 50 commandments just in this parsha. So if you consider that in the Torah there is 613 commandments, and 53 of them are in this parsha. So the percentage, I'm not sure. How do you count percentage? We're not just left. Oh, we have another account here. 1/12. 1/12 of the commandments are only in this big parsha. The name of the parsha is called Mishpatim, which the word Mishpatim means laws. And there is a lot of very interesting laws, many laws, starting with the laws of slaves. Those who were here last week remember maybe the discussion. Why would that be the first of the entire set of laws following Sinai? We have laws of assault and kidnapping. We have laws of adulterous behavior. We have laws about agricultural offerings. We have laws in regard to different injuries caused by your belongings, your ox, your donkey. We have laws about lawns and conquering of the land. A lot of very important ideas is discussed in this week's parsha, and obviously as Rashi says right in the beginning, that the parsha begins with the Hebrew word vehele, and these are the laws. Continuing that not only what we learned last week, the Ten Commandments is one of the laws, is a part of the laws, but all these that we are reading this week is obviously part of the laws given by Moses at Sinai. And according to Rashi, also, these laws that we're learning in this parsha were all related by Moses on this very same day when the Torah was given, actually. At the end of the parsha, there's actually the continuing story of what happened on Sinai. It seems like the Chumash is breaking the story of Sinai into two segments. We have part of the story in the development of Sinai in last week's Torah portion, and part of it is in this week's Torah portion. And basically, as the Rebbe actually explains, that they are discussing two aspects of Sinai. Jethro is mostly involved with the story of the commandments and preparing us to receive the commandments at Sinai. Parshas Mishpatim, in the end of the parsha, the rest of the story is mainly to discuss the covenant which was established at Sinai. Not so much about the commandment, but rather the relationship which was established at Sinai. This is the last part of this week's parsha, but it talks about the offerings and the sprinkling of the blood, and so on. What I'm going to do today, with Hashem's help, like I said, there's such a long parsha, like we always do, we're going to try to concentrate on a very specific mitzvah in this week's parsha. Not getting into all the details. And the specific mitzvah has to do with the responsibilities of a husband to his wife. And even those who are not married yet, or those who were married already, and maybe they're not planning to get married again, whatever your status is, you should learn this parsha, first of all, because it's a part of Torah. And also, I'm sure you can share with friends and other people what does the Torah consider as responsibilities. The obvious, most important biblical requirement which a husband has to his wife is to provide her with food, with clothes, garments, and average marital relations. This is written in this week's Parsha, but in a very unusual content. The content which we are going to study is about a situation, a very unfortunate situation. You have a person who unfortunately has no way to support his family, to a point that he is left with literally nothing in order to provide for them. The house is chaos, there is no food, there is no clothes, the heat is not working. It's in a very difficult situation as far as taking care of his family. He's extremely poor. But God blessed him with children. And he has a daughter, a young girl, who is capable to help. So he thinks about a situation, I'm going to have my daughter being kind of sold to another wealthy family. She's going to help with laundry. She's going to help with taking care of the kids. She's going to help with preparing dinner. She's going to be working for that family. And the money that she's earning by working for the family is going to help the father to support and to bring food on the table. This is called the Hebrew maid. In Hebrew, in the Torah's language, it's called Amma. Amma means a maid, servant, Ivriya, Hebrew. And it's very interesting that the Torah Parsha begins and discusses the idea of a Jewish slave. How is a Jew able to become a slave? So there is two ways how you become a slave. One is the same idea. You tried and you didn't accomplish. You ended up in a situation which is very, very difficult for you to support yourself and your family. So in order to earn some money to be able to send home, so you sell yourself as a servant to a master. The laws of a servant is very difficult, not for the servant, for the master. Because the Torah puts so much restrictions. How much can a master enslave his servant? And how much he has to provide for him? And how much he has to make sure that everything he has should not be that he enjoys something more than his slave. A choice between not so good bread and good bread, you have to give the better bread to your slave. If you have one pillow, you have to give him the pillow and not to yourself. There is a section in Rambam called the laws of slaves, Ilchot Avadim, and you study these laws, and it's like whoever would want to hire a slave, it's almost like
who's the slave and who's the master?
An old man, I imagine, that stands by the window and is looking for help. Hello, can you come help me? A guy walks up the stairs. What can I help you with? He says, I need to tie my shoes. Can you help me? So he says, and what about this guy here? He says, he's my slave. I can't have him do it for me. Because he's my slave, so he can't do these types of work. It's a disrespectful work. It's very, very challenging to own a Jewish slave. You don't want to do it. A Jewish maid doesn't even have a discussion in the Torah because seemingly this shouldn't exist. Torah was very concerned for the vulnerability that a Jewish young woman would be serving as a maid. The only option which exists is the scenario I just described to you, which the Torah says she can only be a young child before turning the age of 12. Once she's 12 years old, she can't work anymore for you. She cannot be a maid anymore. Obviously, if the 6th year, the sabbatical year comes up, again, she goes free. If that came before she turned 12, she goes free. More, the Torah says that the master has to look for ways of allowing yourself to redeem yourself from that position. More interestingly, that's what I want to get into, is that the Torah says that if you have a maid, you should try to get it out of the status of being a maid by offering her to become your wife. Marry her. And if you don't want to marry her, because she's too young and you're a little older, let your son marry her. And there's actually a mitzvah in the Torah, a mitzvah, it's a commandment, to have the Hebrew young maid get married to your master or to your master's son. Interestingly enough, the master doesn't have to doesn't have to give her a ring. Usually, in order to accomplish marriage, called betrothal, so it's done by a ring in front of 2 witnesses that the groom tells the bride, behold, you are betrothed to me with this ring, according to the laws of Moses in Israel. In this case, by a Jewish maid, the halacha is, Jewish law is, that the money that the master paid for a year to become his maid, so he paid some money. Now that he marries her, that money becomes retroactively the ring. That becomes the ring. Then the Torah continues. You marry this maid, and then you decided to marry someone else. You remember, we are talking in a time and place when man was allowed to have more than one wife. In general, you have to put it in the context of time. There was a time and place that for people who were in such poverty, to have an opportunity to work for someone and to bring home, to send home some money was a common thing. The Torah says if the master or the son of the master gets married again, wants to get married again, but now he still has her as a wife, the responsibilities to what you have to your wife, the wife that you chose to marry but came to you by a matchmaker or whatever consideration, not a maid, not from a family who has no money. She that was brought up to you from a nice family who has money and wealth and all the goodies. The Torah says, I'm warning you that you must treat the maid with the very same level of treatment that you hold her as being your first wife, even though now you have a second wife. There is no way of, God forbid, in any way diminishing what she deserves as a wife. Just as a wife who comes from the free world, not from the world of slavery. Let's read inside these few verses. It's on page, if you have this Regalu Chomashim, it's on page 460, it's on chapter 21, verse 7. We're just going to read 4 verses to get us to the context. Chapter 21, verse 7, says the Chumash, V'chi imkor ish et bito le'ama. If a man sells his daughter as a child maid servant, like I told you, a maid servant can only be as long as you're younger than 12. Lo teitzek etzeisa avodim, she should not be freed the same way that non-Jewish male slaves are released. What does it mean? Usually, a non-Jewish slave is also in this week's Parsha. If the master breaks his teeth, blusters his eye, they become free. A Jewish slave must work for 6 years, and he can only be freed after 6 years, or at the Jubilee year. For this girl, that's also if she shows signs of puberty. It means she's not a young child anymore, whichever comes first. So let's say she became a maid at the age of 9, goes by 3 years, she shows signs of puberty, she's out. Let's say she became a maid in the age of 5, started helping in the house in the age of 5. 6 years passed, and she's not 12 yet. She's also going free.
That's the Jubilee is.
Let's say if the Jubilee comes a year after she became a maid, she also goes free. So basically, freedom becomes not like a non-Jewish slave, but the same laws which applies to a Jewish slave. Verse 8. Im ro'o be'einei adineo asher lo ye'odo vehevto. If she displeasing to your master, and he decides not to designate her for himself as a future wife, an act which the Torah recommends. But he doesn't like it. He likes it as a helper in the house, says to pay for it, but not as a wife. Asher lo ye'odo means she was meant to be designated, iyud. That's actually the way the mitzvah is called in halacha. Hebrew maidservant carries the title Yud Ayin Vav Dalet, mitzvat Yud. Imran Kiddushin discussed that in Rambam, but he doesn't like her, and therefore, there's the Torah. Then he must let her be redeemed. You don't just sit with her; you gotta let her go. At that point, le'amnochri lo imshoy lemocho bevigdoivo. Says the Torah, then he must let it be redeemed. If he does betray you by not designating her as a future wife, he does not have the right to sell her to another person. Let's let it go. Fine. Says verse 9, if the master chooses instead to designate it instead of him, so he says, you know what, I'm going to designate here for his son. That's called, like I said, it's called iyud. Iyud in English means designation. Designation for marriage. Then, says the Torah, Mishpat abanot ya'asela. He must treat her like any other girl, which is what? Providing her 3 things: food, clothing, and marital relations. Verse 10, if he keeps the maidservant as a wife and then he takes another wife for himself, he may not diminish from the maidservant your sustenance, number 1, the clothing, number 2, or your times of marital relations. If he does not do these 3 things, designating for himself or for his son, or redeeming her, then she should be released without liability or payment if she shows signs of purity. Verses are pretty clear, right? This is the story of the mitzvah of what's it called? Of Amo Ivriyo, about the maidservant. What's the interesting thing? What's the irony, in a sense? If somebody would look through the entire Bible, entire Torah, and wanting to find where is it that the Torah records the responsibilities which a husband has to his wife, you know what the answer is going to be? Right here. It's not in the content that you marry a woman who you choose to marry and you marry her at a date. wanted a date before, right? You didn't have a date for a long time. So someone who did not eat dates and did not have dates, that's where you find this responsibility of food, clothing, and marital relations. It's not written anywhere else. It's all written in the context of this very unusual situation. A situation where somebody kind of is looking to assist, to support a unfortunate girl. And the Torah says, you want to be nice, it would be great, very nice if you can marry her. It would be nice that you take care of her by marrying her, or you or your son. And then what? Make sure you give her what the woman need to get. Where do I know what women need to get? I will tell you. Women need to be provided with food, with clothing, and marital relations. I'm asking you, is that the place where such an important obligation, which is actually the obligation of the ketubah, the ketubah obligation, which a husband is contracted to provide his wife, writes these very words I just mentioned to you. It's written in Aramaic. It says, no, so it says, umezonaichi, which means mezonot, your food, veksusaichi, and your garments, vesipukaichi, and your needs, umeya levatichi keorach kol ara. And I will live with you as the nature of the world is, when husbands and wife live in, in a healthy manner. It becomes a part of the ketubah, a main part of the ketubah. And the context is the context of a maid. What do you think? I mean, it's very possible that the Torah itself wants to teach us the importance of taking care of our wives. They don't think it's for that very special wife that you so like and you chose and you dated and you decided to marry and the wife that you're going to have your kids with. No, it's across the board. The Torah across the board has a very strong, sensitive responsibility for women. And they want to make sure that women are being provided respectfully and properly. And that is the husband's obligation. Obviously, we're talking in times and it till today, but it was especially important to emphasize it when women did not go to work. They were relying completely on what the man brought home, right? Like our Zadis and Bubbies used to do. I mean, the Bubbies worked hard, but they worked hard at home. But this is the responsibilities. I'm going to share with you a second what the Rambam writes. Maimonides describes this obligation. Oh, wow.
But the robot isn't Jewish. David, the robot isn't Jewish. Yeah, but it's not Jewish, so it doesn't, you don't have to marry the robot.
What? I have to feed the robot.
David, that's how it starts. What is that? What?
You see, what happens if his maidservant is a robot?
Who is that? The one didn't have a date for a while?
Uh-oh.
So first of all, I want to read for you chapter 4, what the Rambam Maimonides says regarding this maid, so you should know what does it mean, how it works. So first of all, the Rambam makes it very clear. This is in chapter 4 in the laws of slave. He writes, a Hebrew maid servant is a girl below the age of maturity, which is below the age of 12, sold by your father. And later, when he talks about sold by your father, he writes it, how would a father sell this girl? So it's important to see, as the Rambam writes, very, very strong words. A father may not sell his daughter as a maidservant unless he became impoverished by the extent that he owns nothing, neither landed property, meaning no real estate, or movable property, not even the clothing that he is wearing. The Rambam Halacha makes it clear that when we talk about this maid, so you shouldn't think of it's like a common practice. Everybody takes his young daughter, go to Mr. So-and-so down the street, Shaike Pfeiffer, who owns a lot of stuff, and he's going to give you a good time, and hopefully you can help us. No, you don't send your daughter out of the house to work like this. We are talking in a very specific situation. As my man describes very clearly, he has nothing, literally nothing. And you can imagine he has to take care of a house, a family, not only himself. Nevertheless, the Rambam even says later, nevertheless, we compel a father to redeem his daughter after he sold her because it is a blemish to your family. The family's repetition will suffer from the shame having sold a daughter into servitude. So this is number one, just to understand the context, when we're dealing with such a halacha. And then later, when he continues and he brings the rest of the laws of this young lady, so he also qualifies, which I said earlier, in Halacha 7, he says, there is a mitzvah to designate. It's called the mitzvah of designating Yud, a maidservant as a wife, and this takes precedence over the mitzvah of redeeming the maidservant. How is the mitzvah of designating a maidservant as a wife being performed? Says the Rambam, the master tells the maidservant in the presence of two witnesses, just like a chuppah, behold, you are consecrated to me, or you are betrothed to me, or behold, you are my wife. This may be done even at the conclusion of the 6 years of her servitude, before the setting of the sun, meaning the last moment of the 6 years, he can still hop around, he can still catch in the idea of marrying her. In my Maimonides says, he doesn't have to give her anything for the first monies. For the first monies were given with the intent that they could serve for the purpose of consecration. The money that the master paid to get her to work for him becomes retroactively the ring. It becomes the money for Kiddushin. And at that point, he must treat her as a wife and not as a servant. Then he continues, one more thing. How does the master designate a maidservant as a wife to his son? Says it clear. If his son is past majority, he gives his father permission to designate the maidservant as his wife. The father tells the maidservant in the presence of the witnesses, behold, you are consecrated to my son. And the same thing, the Rambam makes it very clear. A master may not designate a maidservant as a wife, as his wife, or his son's wife, without her knowledge. Even though your father already received money because of fear, Torah uses the term yiyado, which implies with her knowledge, midata. So there is very clear and very specific condition how this is being done. But this is the halacha that we just read in our verses over here. Yeah.
Did you say knowledge would be acceptance?
Acceptance, yes. Awareness and acceptance. And clearly, the way it's being explained by the commentaries, the famous Chinuch, he writes that the reason for this mitzvah of marrying you, the Chinuch actually says, because God had compassion on this poor girl and compassion on her father, who so-called Nebuch had to sell her. And the reason the Torah wants you to designate it to designate it as your wife. He calls it La Sota Giveret, to make it like a distinguished lady. Kikel Chanun Verachumu, because God is a God of mercy and compassion. And if he doesn't want, at least your son, because she is tismach vetagel, says the chinuch, she will be rejoicing even with the son of a master. The idea is to help it out. What are the three items that just in short, just to have an understanding, the three items that a husband has to provide to his wife? So we said it is number one, food, number two, clothing, and number three, what's it called, marital relationships. But the Rambam also discusses all the halachas in great detail. Regarding food, I'm going to give you just the so-called the synopsis. Regarding food, that's the idea of food. So he says, what is it regarding food? Listen to that. What is the amount? What is the amount that is designated for a woman's sustenance, or I guess for how much would he have to give you? No, says the Rambam. Number one, me allow your bread for 2 meals every day, according to the norm of the people of Ir town. A person who is neither sick or a glutton, a fresser. We give you like an average person, but you have to provide the bread. In addition, she has to be provided with the types of food that are being eaten in this locale, whether it's wheat, barley, rice. And the Rambam goes on, we give you legumes, we give you vegetables. She also is allowed to have oil for her food, light a lamp. You should eat in front of light. Fruit. Then he says, and also a small amount of wine if it is the local custom for women to drink wine. I guess there were different local customs. Comes to Shabbat, 3 meals for Shabbat. He neither mentions meat or fish, again, according to the local custom. People eat sushi, let them deal with sushi. But the funny thing is, and the important thing is, and this comes a very important principle by food and by clothing, that this is all the minimal. If you can afford more, the Rambam's ruling is hakoy lefi oshroi. It means it's all according to his wealth. If his wealth allows him to give you a few meat dishes every day, court forces them to give him meat dishes every day, not only Shabbat. A well-done steak, so that's what he can afford. So that's what you're going to give her. In other words, as much as there is a so-called a fine description of what you have to give her, there is also beyond this description. And this is the general rule, depends what you can afford. There is a minimal. If you cannot afford even the minimal, then you have to let it go. You have to ask for a divorce. But the maximum is no limit. It all depends on your financial statement. This is when it comes to food. When it comes to clothing, Maimonides continues in next chapter, chapter 13. He says, how much clothes does he have to provide for her? So here he goes on with a certain amount of zuzim, which is the ancient currency. I just want to warn you, your wife is listening carefully. It's okay. Certain amount of certain currency, then she gets more clothing during the winter, because she needs more, and a cover for her head, a belt. But then he says also, but practically he ends up by saying the fundamental principle is that he's obligated to provide her with appropriate clothes for the winter and the summer, the minimal that are worn by a married woman in that country. Interestingly, included in the clothing is also shelter, makeup, dishes with what to eat. The Rambam says, similarly, he's obligated to provide you with ornaments. For example, colorant clothes to wrap your head and forehead, eye makeup, robe, and the like. I'm not sure what this is. Another type of color. Rouge. Rouge. My mother never told me about that. So that she will not appear unattractive to him. And again, he says, come, this is all the minimal. If you are able to afford, it's all according to your affordability. And he's obligated even to buy your silk and golden clothing if he can afford it. A free card in Nordstrom, whatever. Blumengate, whatever it's called.
Saks Fifth Avenue.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
does the clothing include jewelry?
Jewelry is included, yes, it says. It's obligated to provide you with ornament.
Thank you.
Ornament, yeah. Oh, is your husband online? When it comes to the third obligation, the marital relationships, the Rambam also goes into great detail. There is a general rule, and the general rule is that there has to be, as it starts up chapter 14, the obligation is as prescribed by the Torah. It says is individual in nature, depending on the strength of each particular man and the type of work what he performs. And it goes in chapter 14, different jobs have different obligations. For some people, there's going to have to be at least once a week. For some people, if they're working on the in the traveling on what's it called, the Navy, once in 6 months. Depends what kind of job. Depends how many wives you have. But clearly, there is a halacha which guides us, and this is the beauty of Torah, that it's not just, come pray and come study. It's a way of life. In every aspect of life, if you do it because this is your biblical obligation, so you are fulfilling the will of Hashem. Like I mentioned earlier, this is across the board. Everybody is obligated. And I mentioned also, it's a part of the ketubah contract. And the obvious question which every groom should ask himself, how can I take up on myself such an obligation? Do I know I'm going to be able to provide it? This is a legal bind, signed by 2 witnesses. You make a little transaction, a kinyan, to show the strength and to enforce that responsibility. But how do I know that I can afford it? So when I'm standing there by the chuppah and I'm saying, I'm just reading you now words of the contract, of the ketubah. Ve'ana eflach, I'm going to work, ve'okir, and respect, ve'izon, and sustain, and support, and give you the food, the clothes, the marital relations, all according to what is required by Torah. I don't know. I'm a 21, 22-year-old boy. I don't have a penny on my soul. I hope it's going to work, but to make it an obligation, this question is a question which is actually asked by the Alter Rebbe, Shner Zalman, in his monumental work called Lekutei Torah, big book on the Chumash. In the end, Parshas Bracha, he discusses it. He raises this question. And he actually says something very interesting, Kabbalistic, based on the Kabbalah, talking Hasidus. The essence of what he says is that when you stand under the chuppah, when a Jewish couple stands under the chuppah, I'm not saying it's not but non-Jewish couples when they marry each other. Non-Jews should marry non-Jews, and Jews should marry Jews. But non-Jews marry non-Jews, they're also getting married. The only marriage which is not recognized by Torah law is when a Jew marries a non-Jew. It's not considered a marriage. It's a companionship, it's a destructive sheep, whatever you can call it, but it's not a marriage. So the Torah says, the Alter Rebbe says, when you stand there, what?
I said an income tax deduction. Or a spouse, so you can file joint.
Okay. David is in the world of taxes, so he calls it a what? A income tax deduction. Okay. Another term. You should not respect it, but if you sign it off as a accountant, so you validated marriage, you have to be careful. It might not be kosher for you.
I could have questioned some people today.
So what's the point? The point is, the Alter Rebbe says something very interesting. He says, when you stand by the chuppah and you chose to get married properly, at that moment, when the union takes place, which is the chuppah, a deposit is made in your account to be able to provide everything you just mentioned. What do you mean a deposit? Obviously, in the world of Kabbalah, we're going into higher worlds than just the physical world that we have over here. And there is the two general worlds called Alma de Iskasia to Alma de Isgalia. The world which is covered and the world which is revealed. Which in the world of godliness means everything essentially comes from God. But from that which is coming from God, in the level and the reality what it is when it's so-called emanating from God, all the way to when it's materialized in the physical world, there's a lot of channels, a lot of levels. And it descends from one world to another, from one level to another, until finally it's also realized in the world of reality and consciousness. But it all starts in its very actual, essential source, the essence of God. So from that essence, for this couple who just decided to get married, in the world, in the reality, and in the consciousness of that spiritual realms, you are given an open check. You do what you want. You have it all. You can tell your wife, I'm going to provide and sustain and give. Akol beseder. It's all good. And therefore, you can say it with confidence. Because Torah believes that you got it. Then comes the negative forces which are trying to prevent it to get to you. When there is a revelation, the negativity comes to take control on it, to try to hold it back, to see that maybe it should not end up in your hands. How do we deal with getting rid of these negative powers? In Kabbalah, the idea is that joy, pure simcha, can eradicate all the prosecutors which are standing by to prevent something good coming to you. Joy has that power. Joy is like a force which causes negativity to disappear, doesn't allow it to work, doesn't allow it to function. Says the Alter Rebbe, Shneur Zalman, that's the reason why it's important to dance at a wedding and to have music at a wedding. Why is it so important to have music? Let's have a small wedding, some sushi, some this. Why do we need to dance? Why do we need to celebrate? That's because the celebration is to ensure that whatever is being provided for you is not held back by the barricades presented by the forces of negativity. And by simcha is what they diminish. As more simcha there is, there's less chance for them to come in and try to disturb it or to challenge it. Simcha. Okay? But now comes the big question. How am I materializing it? It's all good in the world of spirit, but we need bottom line, as they say, right? Bottom line, I have to pay grocery bills tomorrow. I got to pay the credit card bills. I'm going to have to pay the rent. I'm going to have to pay the electricity. What is it going to help me, all these wonderful things, when it comes the bottom line? Meaning, in other words, how am I channeling from that original so-called spiritual reality, which the deposit exists, into the physical world where I need it to be cashed out? Says the Alter Rebbe, for that, you got to honor your wife. This time you're going to listen. Before we spoke about what their obligations, your wife listened. But now you're going to listen. The Alter Rebbe says that what is that you got to do to make it, to translate it into cash, so to speak. The idea is that the channel for parnasa, for sustenance, comes through the way God made it, comes to the wife in the household, not from your husband. It's almost as using the famous phenomenon that Talmud says, the husband can come home with wheat, but now the wheat has to be processed into flour and then into bread. The wife comes in. So you need your wife to make it practical. So that's in the so-called, in the physical format. In the world of spirituality is the same idea. Hashem gives it to you. He gives it to you because this is his commitment that if you're getting married, I'm going to give you a deposit, the indulgence that I have, God says, from the fact that you are standing there as a husband and wife, I'm going to provide you with your needs. But at the same time, to materialize that, that can only come to your wife. This is something which is actually quoted in Jewish law. Shulchan Aruch says that a person should, I think it quotes a certain sage, I think it was Rabbi, who told his students, honor your wives so you should be able to be rich. Now, what I want to take a few minutes, since we have, is this whole idea is obviously not only when there is a wife and a husband, not everybody has a wife, not everybody has a husband, but the ideas of Torah are everlasting. Their spiritual message stands forever. And here's what it's brought down in Hasidic philosophy in regarding these three items called food, clothing, and marital relations. These three ideas is actually based on the famous Midrashim that describes God and the Jewish people also as a husband and wife. So he has to provide us. What does he provide us? He provides us consciousness, an awareness, a divine awareness of his existence. There is that divine awareness which is compared to food. What's the idea of food? You internalize it, you digest it, you bring it in within you, and it becomes part of your being. This is obviously referring to studying Torah. A person studies, you internalize, it becomes part of you, you understand, and you create a relationship which is an open awareness. Obviously, for God to make himself available for us to grasp him, he has to cover himself a little. And we don't get the full thing, but at least the awareness is there. That's the food aspect, the food relationship. Then there is also a relationship which is similar to clothing. What's clothing? The Alter Rebbe says clothing doesn't enter your body, it protects your body, but it's not part of you internally. And this is the higher level of godliness, which doesn't allow himself to be grasped internally. That's called the higher light, soivev, called almin. It's an awareness which helps us. The fact that we know it exists, it gives us the protection from our enemies, from our evil, pursuers. Knowing that there is a higher consciousness which doesn't let it in, but can protect us like garments. But then comes the ultimate connection, that every soul is essentially connected with Hashem. This is like the idea of marital relations. Marital relations is the highest connection, but the very fact that by marital relations you can produce a whole new generation. That means that it has the power of infinity. It can go on and on and on without limits. One generation brought another. And this is the truth about it. This is related to the essence of the soul, which is connected to the essence of Hashem, which you can also give a taste of it by studying Hasidic philosophy. Hasidic philosophy is, on the one end, sustaining, like learning, but you only talk about metaphorical ideas which you can't really grasp in your finite mind. But at the same time, you have an opportunity to express the godly connection, the divine connection, the essential connection. And obviously, since God is religious, I hope, so if we have to provide our wives with whatever the Torah says over here, so he also has to provide his wife with all the needs that he mentions in this week's Parsha, sustenance, clothes, and marital relation, which is assembling all these ideas we mentioned and even more. But I will still leave you with the one question that I don't have a good answer. You can think about it. Why is it that such an important concept of responsibilities which a husband has to his wife is specifically mentioned in the context of the Hebrew maid, which is a very unusual case? I don't have an answer for it. I don't have a good answer. You have a good answer? Think about it, come back. We might put it up for sale or for grab. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Hope
you,
learned
Rabbi.
something. We'll see you again, Bezrat Hashem, next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
But
Thank you.
meantime, you can look back to the Parsha. There's a lot to study this week's Parsha. A lot. So every verse you're going to meet a lot of interesting insights and information. You can live with throughout the day and throughout the week, especially this coming Shabbat. Tonight, I have to mention, it's also a very special yahrzeit. It's the 22nd of Shvat, at the yahrzeit of the Rebbe's wife. She was known as Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka. Speaking about marriage and the whole ideas of marriage, obviously that was a couple who gave their life completely away to the Jewish people, to the welfare and well-being of the people of the world. The Rebbe's emissaries throughout the world. It's all the Rebbe didn't have physically children, but they all considered a part of his children. He definitely provided us his sustenance by his teachings, and made the Rebbe and Chaim Mushke continue to be an inspiration for all of us, and their soul should stand for a merit for everyone in the world, especially like I'm sure you follow the news. It's apparently not going to be such an easy day this morning in Israel when some of the unfortunate sacrifices who were brutally murdered by the terrorists, Yamach Shemam, are going to come home in caskets. And it's not going to be easy, especially the mother and two kids, the Bibas family that we were all waiting for their return. But we will continue and prevail. And God should give us the courage to hold strong together. And Be'ezrat Hashem, only light and good energy. Good night, everyone.
Thank you,
And
Rabbi.
Thank you.
happy
Bye.
days. Thank you.
Thank you.
Rabbi,
Yeah,
this is the Parsha from our wedding,
this is the Parsha of
our wedding,
your wedding.
40 years.